Okay, I'm Dr. Peter Bailey, Chair of the School of English Studies. I'll be moderating this session and introducing our next speaker. Dr. Mayuri Deka is Associate Professor in the School of English Studies. She's also a former chair of the school. She specializes in post-colonial studies and is often thinking about critical pedagogy, democracy, and stuff that is relevant to this conference. So without further ado, I will introduce her. She'll speak for about 30 minutes or so. And then we'll have...
At 30 minutes and I'll stop.
And then we'll have time for question and answer afterwards. Okay.
I will stop. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here today. Some people, I'm sure, were worried about having to swim here, but here we are on a lovely sunny day to talk about something extremely important to us at this point of history. So my talk, as you see, the title is The Praxis of Democratic Values, the Teaching of Literature in a Technological Age. So this is going to be, I assume, a little different than every other talk that is there in the conference, because we are going to talk about the space that we are in now, which is the university, and specifically about the humanities, and even more specifically about the literature and literary studies and the state that they are in right now. Now, probably this paper should also have been one of the last papers to go in this conference, because there is an assumption I make that democratic values are crucial and core to pro-social activities and to pro-social thinking. So I'm just going to make that assumption and build on that sort of framework that is there. So one of the things that we are seeing across the globe is that there is a cutting of federal and state funding for humanities and especially literature programs. A lot of the rationale that goes behind these funding cuts is low student enrollment, or there is disproportionate faculty-student ratios. But what we are also seeing, that the underlying debate that is going on under this is about the value of humanities, the value of literature, and indeed the value of liberal education itself. And this is what I really want to talk about, and the importance of liberal education and literature to the democratic values that we hold true. This is not a new debate. This is not a new debate at all. But it has become very virulent in the past 10 years or so, and we are now seeing real policy change that is being enacted. Literature faculty especially are having to really sort of justify their experience and their existence in this geopolitical space that is there. However, this backlash that we are seeing is reflective of the trends seen in the larger geopolitics of the world and the nation. And that is what I would like to start with. So the nation state is managed by the national government, and it remains the fundamental building block of a democratic nation's economy and legal system. However, we are increasingly seeing that there is a disillusionment with the elected governments, and this is across the world. We are seeing this. A part of this backlash is against increasing globalization and the impact it has on national policy. Along with that, we are seeing a backlash of that impact on the execution of these policies at every level of the government. And I think we can really connect this to what happened in the Bahamas in the last few days with the flooding in different parts and the reaction to that flooding and the responsibility of the government, right? The debates and the discussions that are going around are within that, right? According to Harvard economist Danny Roderick, it is impossible to fully have national sovereignty, democracy, and globalization simultaneously. So, according to him, it is impossible to have full national sovereignty, democracy, and globalization at the same time. This is the concept of the political trilemma of the world economy. And this is what you're seeing right there. And in fact, Javier Solana also discusses this and talks about this quite a bit. Now, Roddick's argument is that too much globalization erodes sovereignty, and democratic nations are not able to perform at the level that is required as an independent nation. And increasingly, we see the impact of globalization and how it erodes that sovereignty in economic and financial forces that may not correspond to the values of the democratic majority. So what is happening is when globalization is a huge part of a nation's sovereignty, then decisions are made, especially economic and financial, that are based on those suprabox requirements rather than what the democratic majority wants. Governments are increasingly responding to global issues from the perspective of the supranatural blocks like BRICS, like EU, like the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, or with global institutions like the UN, IMF, WHO, and so on. So government are taking more consideration and making decisions based on the perspective of these supernatural blocks rather than the desires of the citizens. So this growing distrust of the citizens towards the functioning of democracy in existing governments throughout the world is partly a backlash against a certain kind of globalization. However, I think it is possible to complicate Roddick's argument further and focus not only on decision making on the national state, but also how that might threaten to resurrect all the economic and political philosophies and pathologies that nationalism incited in the past, and then some. In fact, we were just talking about the Weimar Republic just now before I started talking, and this is an indication of that, right? This can be this can be seen in India right now, where the present government is retreating to nationalism and to the importance of the nation state as a way of defining its identity. Now, however, that might have changed since January a little bit with the geopolitical movements that are happening, and we saw that in the BRICS conference that took place. However, the growing distress of citizens is further identified by growing feelings of disconnect with the government, where the citizen feels powerless and unable to affect change within the system. This has not only resulted in, to some extent, to the disconnect of the citizen to the national and the federal level government, but also a distress for the entire democratic process that there is. So, a lot of people don't want to vote anymore, especially the younger generation, because they don't feel that their vote matters, right? However, there is a very slow but effective revolution that is underway at this point that makes the individual citizen's efficacy within a democratic nation possible. So in the last half of the 1900s, we saw that there was a massive investment in technology, especially in the bubble era, which resulted in expansion of channels that connected people. Furthermore, at the same time, there was an increase in investment in software like email, search engines like Google. Now we have the proliferation of AI and proprietary software, and computers are becoming very common and cheaper to buy. Now, this has given a new dimension to freedom of the individual. especially since the 2000s. And this allows people to collaborate and compete globally. Now, Thomas Friedman, in his book, The World is Flat, talks about the flat platform, the flat world platform, which saw, and this is how he defines it, the flat world platform is a convergence of the access to personal computers, fiber optic cable, and the rise of workflow software. So now think back to pandemic times and how our lives to a large extent actually was defined by technology, right? Now this new convergence, it sees a shift in the key players of the world, because now rather than multinational companies, it is the individual who is the vital agent of change in the world. People all over the world are realizing that they have more power than ever to go globally as individuals. So they can reach larger crowds, they can have a much bigger platform than they have ever had before. While supernatural institutions continue to exert influence on governmental policy, especially financial policy, advancement in technology has allowed the individual and large numbers of individuals to have an impact on the decision-making process of governments. And we are seeing this across the world. So an example that I want to pull is actually one of the first examples where we saw this very clearly happening. And this was seen in the Egyptian Revolution. On 25th of January 2011, hundreds and thousands of protesters gathered at Tahrir Square and planted the seeds of unrest, which later led to the removal of the President Hosni Mubarak after 30 years of presidency. Almost a year later that, in fact, Tunisia had a similar revolution where they removed their president, and it led to a wave of protests across Middle East and North Africa, and it became known as the Arab Spring at that time. So the reason why this revolution is particularly interesting to us for this presentation is because of the role of internet, social media, mobile phone, and other technologies that was used in this revolution process. In fact, at times during 2011, the term Arab Spring became interchangeable with Twitter uprising and Facebook revolution. So people were using those tags as well, right? And this led to global institutions trying to figure out what is actually happening, because the change of protest, because the face of protest has changed, the channel had changed, right? So technological tools were being used by those pursuing more participatory governance, especially in Egypt. And many have used them to great impact since then. Perhaps, again, most famously on the April 6th youth movement, and by Wahid Gohim. He was the Google executive at that point, who was one of the creators of the We Are All Khalid Saeed Facebook group, and that led to huge social media campaigns, especially on YouTube. And both have been appreciated a whole lot by Western media for galvanizing and connecting a new generation of young people to activists and to people who are involved in the platform for participatory democracy. However, we also have to acknowledge that technology was only used marginally, even though it seemed like it was used across the board. There has to be that acknowledgement, right? And it was used by certain factions of the protest, right? Because it was barely used, even mobile phones were barely used by the labor movement or the judiciary during that movement. However, the use of mobile phones not only enabled the Egyptian people to coordinate the protests that were going on, to stay informed, and to communicate between themselves, but it also allowed them to create a narrative about the protest to the global world, to the entirety of the world. I mean, at least till the point where the internet was blocked, which happened on February 3rd, 2011. The government completely blocked internet and we lost that connection. But even then, by that time, they had established a certain narrative of the protest to the global world, right? And it allowed them to document what was happening during the protest. And it gave the protesters a sense of ownership that they felt they had been missing in the democratic process. Their videos and photos were used to shape the story that will live on forever. So this increased this increased inclusion of technology, and it was seen as the way that led to increased participation. Now, one of the protesters, and I think this is a quote that went viral, in fact, and this is by one of the protesters, Fawaz Rashid, and he wrote, "We used Facebook to schedule the protests, Twitter to coordinate, and YouTube to tell the world. And this revolution really did encompass all of that technology to be successful." And right now, to connect with what is going on in the world, the reason why we are seeing such a large and global platform of protest in the Gaza-Israel war is because of the use of technology to a large extent. People are seeing videos and photos that are constantly coming out from Gaza, and that is having an impact on the narrative that is going on about the war. And this is a narrative that is very different than even a few years ago. And so we see a shift in how people view this war and what investment they have in the democratic process because of the use of technology, and very effective use of technology, one might say. And in fact, just now before coming in, I saw, I think it was a DW News short, and they were calling this summer a contagion Gen Z protest summer. Because what is happening across the world, and if you look across the world, whether we're talking about Philippines, whether you're talking about Nepal, whether we are talking about the Western world, all across the Western world, Europe, we are seeing Gen Z really picking up the reins in terms of participatory democracy and really making themselves heard, not only on the streets, but on media, on social media. And that is really being used to a large extent. And we are seeing presidencies fall, we are seeing governments being overturned, we are seeing corrupt ministers and prime ministers being removed from positions because of these protests. And the narrative is changing. Much of the global outrage has been based on this widespread international sort of platform of videos, images, and other multinational content. And this is something that is seen globally. However, again, in fact, can I just point out, this is a really great video that Al Jazeera has. It's a short documentary in case you're interested in this topic. It's an interesting video to watch on this topic. It just was, I think, released like yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, or the day before. Nonetheless, we have to be real about this use of technology, right? The use of technology has always been aspirational. It boils down to access and power, along with textual and technological literacy. Technology played a defined and concrete role in the revolution, but this contribution was complementary rather than the core, right? Because not everyone has technology. Who has technology is a question of power, it's a question of access, and it is a question of whether there is digital literacy to understand how to use that technology effectively, right? So technology facilitated and encouraged connections and organizations that would have happened anyways. So the forces of reform in Egyptian society have deep roots, and they would have ultimately utilized other methods to achieve their goals, even if technology was not available to people, right? So we have to be a little bit realistic about how much is used, right? Even in the Nepal protests that are going on now, it is called the Nepo protest, right? Because what Gen Z is protesting against is corruption and Nepo babies. That's the tagline they are going with. But the use of technology by the protesters is also bringing up questions about who these protesters are themselves, that they have the access to this much technology and have the knowledge to use it. So it's a little bit of a complicated platform or a debate that we need to talk about. It's not as simplistic as just use of technology, right? While it is likely that many observers will probably argue that it is access to technology that did speed up the process and the pace at which reform was possible, because it lowers the cost of recruitment and organization. It provides opportunities to organizations to protest rather than just the traditional methods could. But we do, again, have to take into account who has access to it. Indeed, we see a shift in the spread of use of technology and digital platforms between the revolution then in Egypt to the protests in Nepal and Philippines today. We see some of this even in the Bahamas, like I said, in the last few days, because of the use of digital platforms that people have. They have been able to not only spread information about the after effects of the storm, but also to protest and to show their disappointment, maybe in the government system or in their MPs individual. But there has been protest that has been increasing with the use of digital platforms. And this allows the citizens to feel like they have a voice within the democratic process, right? So technology could therefore become an effective tool to encourage individual citizens to participate in the democratic process. But even more than participation, it is possible to use technology to promote pro-social action and thinking. Now, as an educator, I firmly believe that this is up to us to provide the tools to our students to not only be critical consumers of social media, but also creators of material pro-social messages. So I think this is something that is onto us as educators. While most of our students are actually quite technologically advanced and active, the classroom can become a space which creates an opportunity for the students to become not only active learners, but also pro-social thinkers. Now, for instance, DFINC thinks that learning in terms of lasting change is as important to a student's life as is knowledge. And I agree with this definition of learning. Learning must involve Learning must involve some sort of noticeable change in the student's life, which encourages them to interact with who they consider the other, someone they see as distant and separate from themselves, basically, in more novel ways, and to develop more affective responses, cognitive representations, and pro social motives to behave in a more democratic manner. So, students must learn not only how to engage in new forms of intellectual and social actions by integrating different realms of their life, but they also need to understand the personal and social implications of their knowledge. I think that is crucial at this point of geopolitical space that we are in. It is not enough to just give our students the strategies to utilize social media and digital platforms, but we also need to teach our students the importance of personal and social implication that that information has on the world around them, to think about it from a pro-social perspective. And the fact is really that we need to connect our students, or we need to show our students that when they are in the classroom, it is not just about the knowledge within the classroom that they are gaining, but they need to connect that knowledge to the outside world. So it's not just about getting a job, or it's not just about getting a skill set, but that knowledge can actually be transferred to movements and to values that are outside the classroom. The more they care about something, whether it is people, whether it is interests, whether it is feelings, the more energy they will have to learn about it. So if they get interested about a certain culture, then they are willing to spend more energy reading up about it, learning about it. And the more energy they will have to take positive action if those peoples are being harmed in certain ways, right? And it will lead to positive action that results in social involvement and change within society. Thus, when students learn something about themselves and or they learn something about the other, it gives them a new image of their own self and a vision of what they want to become through interactions with each other. So the classroom really is not just a space that is intrapersonal, right? Where you only learn things that are important to you. I really believe the classroom should be a space that should be interpersonal, where you learn about the other. And by that, I don't just mean your classmate, I mean the other that is there in society as well, the larger world. So a pedagogy that is designed to enhance a student's pro-social behavior by supporting their identity development and security, and by increasing their capacity for empathy through technology, could enhance their democratic participation. Pro-social pedagogy does this by supporting a sense of self in the students and developing their empathic affects and motives within the classroom, so that there is alteration in their cognitive process to lead habitually towards pro-social change. So when students are in the classroom and we introduce them to new information, it can go both ways. Either they're happy to accept that new information because they see some similarity or some use or relevance in that information to themselves, or it can go exactly the opposite way, where they are extremely resistant to that information. And I can tell you, as someone who teaches world literature and post-colonial literature, a lot of times the novels and poems that we are reading, students are quite hesitant and quite resistant to reading them. And it simply starts with, I can't even understand these names, so I can't remember the names, so I can't follow this story because I can't remember these names, right? So it starts at that point and then it becomes larger and larger, right? But you have lost that engagement that the student had with that novel and therefore that culture and the people that novel represents, right? In fact, I just had that happen to me this week, right? So, what do you do as a professor, right? Do you just say, okay, keep reading it more, which a lot of us tend to do, and at one point you will engage, right? Because the hope is if they keep reading it, if they keep getting more information and more knowledge about this culture, then they will see that there's value to it, right? So our answer tends to be, no, you know what? I know it's hard, but keep reading. You'll get it, right? But do they really get it? Right? Or have we lost them? Right? They might read the novel because you have a test after that. So they need to write that test or they have to write a paper on it. But was there any real engagement that they had with the novel and by extension, the culture that we are talking about? Right? So we really need to rethink how we approach these subjects and these spaces that students don't feel comfortable in, and think about it from our perspective as teachers of what we can do to bridge that gap, right? And the reason, if you really think about it, that students are resistant to this information is because it's too foreign, it's too alien, it's too other, right? And they don't see any similarity between themselves and this culture and people that is there. And they are too far away for me to bother about them. Right? And so it is important, extremely important, to think about how we teach and trying to create pedagogy that creates or allows the student to be secure in themselves while they are engaging with the other is extremely important, therefore. So pro-social pedagogy does this by supporting the student's sense of self and developing their empathic affects and motives. Research by Dermon shows that people are more willing to help another person if they can empathize with them and identify commonalities between the self and other. So if people see a similarity with another person, then they are more willing to help that person. And this is based on universal affective states. So basically, those similarities that we see with other people is based on feelings like happiness, sadness, because all of us have those feelings, and culture and identity does not divide us on that. So if you see a newborn baby, maybe you're happy. If you lose someone, you're sad. So these are things that are transnational, transglobal, and therefore those are the spaces that can allow us to build those similarities. Now, the literature classroom is well suited to create this new form of assessing, evaluating, and judging the other to lead towards pro-social change. In general, literature classrooms present the absentee other, right? We read about cultures and people who are unfamiliar and distant. That is the nature of most of literature, right? The characters that the students read about are neither in their in-group nor are they present in front of them, right? Indeed, there's no need for the students to empathize with these others at all. Moreover, people are increasingly finding it hard to disconnect with the social media storm that is there and then maintain their sense of self. And that is actually leading to the crisis of identity that we see across the world. In fact, MSN just did a survey this week where they found that most men in the survey wanted to return to traditional gender roles, but most women did not want to return to traditional gender roles, right? So we are seeing a disconnect in many forms of identity throughout the world. So it is extremely important to think about what it is or what affects and what strategies we are giving our students to engage in a world that is becoming increasingly, I think, difficult, increasingly unfamiliar, because we are being sort of hit on